Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 9, the final session of a series of introductory talks on Zionism and its victims. Today, we're going to talk about the period between 2005 and October 6, 2023. In January 2005, Palestinians in the occupied territories went to the polls and elected the Fatah candidate Mahmoud Abbas as president of the PA, or Palestinian Authority. A month later, Abbas and Sharon agreed to a ceasefire. Hamas respected it, and acts of arms resistance dropped off dramatically. The ceasefire marked the end of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. The Israeli forces had killed nearly 5,000 Palestinians, 1/4 of them children. They had wounded 10,000 children and demolished 6,000 homes. About 700 Israeli civilians had been killed. The Al-Aqsa Intifada profoundly impacted the Israeli public. The suicide bombings had shattered their sense of security. Everyone knew at least one victim. The bombings had also hardened their resolve, and most believed that it was impossible to trust the Palestinians. Right-wing politicians gained influence, and support for the occupation grew. In many ways, the Palestinians, quote, lost the Al-Aqsa Intifada. The PA had proved itself impotent and unable to lead, and Israel's invasion of Palestinian cities and towns confirmed that sovereignty was a myth. The entire West Bank was Area C, under complete Israeli control. Internationally, the bombings had reinforced the image of Israel as the victim of fanatical terrorists. The never-ending global, quote, war on terror was in full throttle, and Palestinians were reduced to being stereotyped as terrorists. In August 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip and evacuated the several thousand settlers who lived there. It was a controversial decision, but Sharon assessed that Gaza was not an integral part of Greater Israel and that protecting the settlers there had become too big a burden. Israeli leaders also wanted to achieve a better, quote, demographic situation. They feared that Palestinians, with their higher birth rate, might stop negotiating and simply wait until they became a majority between the river and the sea, and then demand equal voting rights. Removing the 1.3 million Gazans from direct Israeli control would delay that possibility. However, one Israeli expert offered an Israeli vision of a dystopian future. Quote, when 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will become even bigger animals than they are today with the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam. The pressure at the border will be awful. If we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. If we don't kill, we will cease to exist. The PA remained plagued by corruption and a reliance on foreign aid that totaled $1 billion annually, the highest per capita in the world. Much of it was controlled by Western NGOs who had their own agendas and hired top Palestinian talent with offers of exorbitant salaries. Some believe that this was an attempt to lure Palestinians away from political activism. This emerging, quote, Palestinian global elite usually lived in the, quote, gilded economic bubble of Ramallah, the provisional capital of the PA, that was full of office towers, hotels, and expensive restaurants, and divorced from the hardship of the occupied territories. Meanwhile, the occupation ground on. Palestinian population centers were becoming Bantustans, isolated by checkpoints, settlements, and settler-only roads. Israel restricted freedom of movement, and permits were needed to travel between towns. A World Bank report noted, quote, on any given day, the ability to reach work, school, shopping, healthcare facilities, and agriculture is highly uncertain and subject to arbitrary restriction and delay. So you can't really go more than 20 minutes in the West Bank without coming across a checkpoint of some sort. And so here are some images of some of the many. They say there's an estimate nowadays, it's about 900 checkpoints of various sorts or road closures. With the end of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, Palestinians reverted to popular nonviolent civil resistance. Regular demonstrations took place in villages such as Budros and Belin, both of which had been deprived of their land by the separation wall. These demonstrations garnered a lot of international attention, especially in Berlin. In July 2005, over 170 Palestinian organizations representing refugees, inhabitants of the occupied territories, and 48 Palestinians signed an open letter seeking international support for a boycott, sanctions, and divestment initiative, also known as BDS. Quote, "We, representatives of Palestinian civil society, call upon international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. We appeal to you to pressure your respective states to impose embargoes and sanctions against Israel." The BDS movement demanded, quote, number one, an end to the occupation, colonization of all Arab lands, and dismantling the wall. Two, extending full equality to 48 Palestinians. And three, promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties. The movement also called for boycotting companies that profited from the occupation. Israel accused the BDS campaign of being fueled by anti-Semitism and started producing anti-BDS Hasbara, or propaganda. In 2006, pressure from the Quartet on the Middle East, you may remember that's the United States, the UN, the European Union, and Russia. Pressure from the Quartet caused the PA President Abbas to hold legislative elections in the occupied territories, the first in 10 years. The Quartet believed that the PA's main role was to cooperate with Israel and prevent violence against Israelis. It predicted that Fatah would win, and then a, quote, democratically legitimized and strengthened Abbas could restart the peace process on Israel's terms. Surprisingly, Hamas decided to participate and campaigned on a platform of change and reform. Their goal was to win enough seats to form a unity government with Fatah. Their election manifesto read in part, quote, "The Change and Reform List seeks to build an advanced Palestinian civil society that is based on political pluralism and the alternation of power, and seeks to direct the Palestinian political system and its political reform program in a manner that would accomplish the national rights of the Palestinian people, while bearing in mind the existence of the heavy, detested, an oppressive occupation in our land and people, and taking into consideration its overt interventions in every single detail of Palestinian life. Why this change in course? There were several reasons. One, a historian explained, was, quote, the learning curve and maturation of a political movement that suddenly had to deal with the actually existing world and all of its required compromises. Other reasons included a diversity of recruits and increased contact with the outside world, diplomats, politicians, and journalists. This had exposed the leaders to a diversity of viewpoints that had influenced their political thinking. As well, many Hamas leaders had been killed during the 1990s in the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and a new generation had emerged who were, quote, predisposed to the feasibility of electoral politics. Like any movement, Hamas had its moderates and hardliners. And following the failure of armed resistance during the Intifada, these new pragmatic moderates were on the rise. For them, academic Tarek Bakoni observed, quote, resistance naturally encompassed a political element, and the political arena was an extension of military policies. Electoral participation was, quote, intended to liberate the PA from Fatah's clutches and use its institutions to strengthen the Palestinian resistance. To some, Hamas's participation indicated a tacit acceptance of Oslo and the two-state solution. There was no explicit recognition of Israel, but rather an acknowledgement of the Jewish state as a political reality. Voter turnout was high at 77%, and international monitors reported a clean election. It was a massive upset, with Hamas winning 45% of the popular vote and an absolute majority of seats. Even Christian neighborhoods voted Hamas. The results were seen as a protest vote against Fatah's corruption and decay. By contrast, the UN official observed, quote, Hamas was seen as attentive to people's needs and untainted by corruption. Abbas now had to work with a legislature where the majority opposed Oslo, did not recognize Israel, and were members of a US designated terrorist organization. The animosity between Hamas and Fatah grew, but a public outcry for unity persuaded them to form a unity government consisting mostly of technocrats. Israel and the quartet condemned the election results. Israel announced that it would boycott the PA. It feared that a Palestinian unity government would force them to resume peace talks and make significant concessions. The quartet demanded that Hamas recognize Israel, renounce violence, and accept previous agreements signed by the PA. An Israeli intelligence officer described these conditions as, quote, ridiculous and an excuse not to negotiate. Why should the Palestinians stop fighting against us until they know we're willing to make an agreement? Hamas rejected the quartet's conditions. Why should they recognize Israel if Israel doesn't recognize a Palestinian state? As concerns violence, a Hamas leader said, quote, as long as we are under occupation, then resistance is our right. In an uncharacteristic moment of candor, Senator Hillary Clinton voiced what many Westerners had been thinking. Quote, if we were going to push for an election, then we should have made sure that we did something to determine who was going to win. This Western hypocrisy was not lost on Hamas and other Palestinians. In recent years, Western nations had invaded Afghanistan and Iraq to promote democracy. Yet, in the occupied territories, they had just witnessed a shining example of democracy in action, and yet they rejected the results because Palestinians had voted for the, quote, wrong party. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh became the new prime minister of the PA, and he quickly proposed a long-term hudna, which is Arabic for ceasefire, truce, or armistice. He proposed this to Israel and America. A hudna is binding, and the Quran prohibits breaking it. Hamas had previously made similar offers, and this one proposed a 50-year hudna. It was conditioned on the establishment of a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders, with Jerusalem as its capital. America and Israel did not respond. Instead, the quartet refused to compromise, boycotted Hamas, and started destabilizing the new PA government to force new elections. They hoped to weaken Hamas and help Fatah stage a coup and regain power. The U.S. also passed economic sanctions designed to cripple the unity government. Added to this external opposition was the reluctance of longtime PA Fatah appointees to risk losing their privileges and perks. The combined pressure was too much, and the unity government crumbled. For the next year or so, Fatah and Hamas waged a civil war over the control of Gaza. For Hamas militants, it was a case of, quote, eat or be eaten. Memories of PA security forces hunting them down during the 1990s were still fresh, and they feared the worst if the PA gained control of Gaza. In mid-2007, Hamas learned that the Americans and Israelis were supplying Fatah with arms. Seeing this as a, quote, plan approved by the Americans to destroy the political choice, Hamas seized control of Gaza in 8 days of fierce fighting. The occupied territories were now divided and ruled by two antagonistic governments. Hamas's well-meaning but unsuccessful attempt to engage in the democratic process and its subsequent rejection by the West had a powerful long-term influence on the collective psyche of the movement. Power swung back to the hardliners, and the schism between the two factions grew and, quote, sowed the seeds of October 7th. Israel welcomed the division between the PA and Hamas and sealed Gaza off, declaring it to be, quote, hostile territory. This near total blockade or siege endures to this day. The result, an Israeli intelligence officer said, is, quote, a huge concentration camp in which half the prisoners are children. The Israeli blockade had three goals. First, to separate Gazans from the West Bank. As long as Hamas ruled Gaza and the PA ruled the West Bank, Israel could say that it had, quote, no partner for peace. Second, one observer noted, Israel wanted, quote, to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. The hunger pangs are supposed to encourage the Palestinians to force Hamas to change its attitude. The effects were devastating. Within 6 months, shortages of vital supplies were widespread, and 80% of Gazans were dependent on humanitarian aid. Half the families were eating only one meal a day. The final goal was described as, quote, econocide. To, quote, de-develop Gaza and make it impossible for the economy to grow or sustain the population. Gaza would become a humanitarian issue with a submissive population dependent on international aid. An Israeli described the policy as, quote, no development, no prosperity, only humanitarian dependency. Israel claimed that its withdrawal from Gaza marked the end of its occupation. However, the UN, the EU, and many governments and human rights groups disagreed and condemned Israel's blockade as collective punishment and a violation of international law. They were right. According to international law, Israel remained an occupying power as it controlled Gaza's borders, airspace, territorial waters, population registry, economy, water, electricity, and telecommunications. It also controlled almost everything and everyone entering and leaving. Gaza was occupied territory. After the blockade began, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other resistant groups began firing primitive rockets into the bordering Israeli towns and countryside. Israel retaliated with military strikes and assassinations of Islamic military and political leaders. This tit for tat continued until June 2008, when Egypt brokered a 6-month ceasefire, calling for an end to rocket fire and a lifting of the blockade. Hamas complied, but Israel only allowed a slight lifting of the blockade. By this point, conditions in Gaza had worsened. The head of UNRWA observed, quote, Gaza is on the threshold of becoming the first territory to be intentionally reduced to a state of abject destitution, with the knowledge, acquiescence, and some would say encouragement of the international community. In November 2008, Israeli forces violated the ceasefire by killing 6 Hamas operatives. Hamas retaliated with rockets. In mid-December, Hamas proposed renewing the ceasefire and ending rocket attacks if Israel opened the border crossings and stopped its attacks. The offer was repeated on 3 occasions, but Israel rejected them, only agreeing to a 15% resumption of aid. At that point, Hamas, with local popular support, decided that if it had to choose between death by starving or F-16 fighter jets, it would choose the latter. On December 27, 2008, Israel attacked Gaza in Operation Cast Lead, using fighter jets, helicopter gunships, and drones. Israel claimed it was acting in self-defense, but its unstated political objectives were to inspire fear in the Arab world and frustrate Hamas diplomatic overtures. That first day, they killed 225 Palestinians, the highest one-day death toll in 60 years. Reactions to the invasion varied. Israelis overwhelmingly supported it. However, 48 Palestinians demonstrated their solidarity with the people of Gaza in their largest protest ever, 100,000 people. Internationally, most of the global South were outraged. The EU called for a ceasefire and a resumption of humanitarian aid. The Americans, along with other Western countries, supported the invasion, repeating the mantra, quote, Israel has a right to defend itself. President Bush, who was about to leave office, gave Israel the green light to send in ground troops. Israel systematically targeted non-military infrastructure such as government offices, a university, hospitals, water treatment plants, and factories. Finally, on January 18th, a ceasefire took effect. The invasion had claimed the lives of 14 Israelis and 1,400 Palestinians, of whom 1,000 were civilians. Israeli forces had destroyed 15% of all the buildings in Gaza. By contrast, rockets had destroyed 1 Israeli structure and damaged several others. Israel claimed self-defense according to the UN Charter, which allows a country to defend itself. However, this was disputed for at least 2 reasons. First, the invasion was not a, quote, last resort, as Israel had not exhausted all available options. Notably, it had refused Hamas' offer of a ceasefire. And second, an illegal occupying power cannot claim self-defense against the people it occupies and oppresses. Just as Japanese occupiers in the Philippines during World War II could not claim self-defense against resistance fighters there, so Israel could not claim self-defense against Palestinians who were resisting occupation. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch affirmed that Israel committed the majority of war crimes. The invasion was a form of collective punishment. As well, Israel's blockade of international aid and denial of necessities, its deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure and use of heavy artillery in populated areas, and its killing of civilians and the use of Palestinian children as human shields were all, quote, prima facie war crimes. The UN tasked Richard Goldstone, a South African judge with international experience, to head an inquiry. The Goldstone report confirmed the conclusions of the human rights groups. It also concluded that Israel had engaged in a, quote, deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population, diminish its local economic capacity both to work and provide for itself, and to force upon it an ever-increasing sense of dependability and vulnerability. The UN General Assembly and the European Parliament overwhelmingly approved the Goldstone report. The Americans rejected it. Israel had a name for the disproportionate force that the Goldstone report referred to. The Dahieh doctrine was named after the Beirut suburb of Dahieh that Israel had destroyed, claiming it was a Hezbollah stronghold. 3 months before Operation Cast Lead, an Israeli army spokesperson stated that Israel would use the strategy in future conflicts. He asserted, quote, "What happened in Dahieh will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages. They are military bases. This is not a recommendation. This is a plan." In February 2009, Israelis elected a new right-wing, settler-dominated coalition government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. This marked the death of the Israeli left, which had been on life support for several years. The new government opposed any peace plan. Meanwhile, President Barack Obama had taken office in the United States. That June, while visiting Cairo, he affirmed America's support for Israel, condemned the settlements, voiced support for Palestinian self-determination, and pledged to restart the peace process. Netanyahu countered with the usual offer of a Palestinian state that would be nothing more than a ghetto or Bantustan. He then added a new demand that Palestinians must recognize Israel as a Jewish state, the homeland of the entire Jewish people. Palestinians dismissed this as tantamount to recognizing Zionism. Hanan Ashrawi declared, quote, "I will not be a Zionist and no Palestinian will." Gaza remained under siege with humanitarian aid shipments subject to the whims of the Israelis. At one point, they barred a container of pasta, declaring it to be a luxury item. The Americans in EU shunned contact with Hamas, and the PA referred to Gaza as, quote, "an emirate of darkness," and continued collaborating with Israel in hunting down Hamas militants in the West Bank. During this time, a modest middle class was emerging in parts of the West Bank, especially around Ramallah. The resulting individualism meant that, in contrast to Gaza, more West Bank Palestinians were, quote, "protecting their personal interests above the collective interests and concerns of the community." Increasingly, they had something to lose and were less interested in rocking the boat. In September 2010, Obama held a round of peace negotiations. Attendance was mandatory. Nothing came of them as Netanyahu remained intransigent and committed to building settlements. As well, a key player, Hamas, was not invited. Hamas denounced the talks. An American intelligence report affirmed that Hamas was a serious political player, respected at the grassroots level. Ignoring or destroying it was not an option. Why not try to integrate Hamas into the PA? The report also pointed out that Israel's siege on Gaza was probably radicalizing the young and providing recruits for Hamas. By early 2011, Palestinians were calling in vain for national unity. The PA remained adrift. Abbas's presidential term had ended, and he was ruling by decree. The Legislative Council had not met since 2007. Abbas extricated himself from this domestic quagmire by seeking international recognition in order to pressure Israel. A year later, in November 2012, The UN General Assembly upgraded Palestine to a non-member state with observer status. This gave the PA access to international organizations such as the International Criminal Court. I'd like to take a moment now to make a few personal observations. In early 2012, I first visited Israel, Palestine, and for 2.5 weeks, I traveled throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem, staying with Palestinian families and taking political tours. The brutality of the occupation shocked me. 3 memories stand out. During a day tour to Hebron, or Al-Halil, we had lunch in the home of a Palestinian human rights activist, Hashem El-Azeh. As we discussed peace negotiations, he declared, quote, "Give me my rights, and then I will negotiate." This helped me to grasp how Israel and the West expects Palestinians to negotiate for basic human rights. During one tour, Israeli soldiers stopped our Palestinian guide, this was in Hebron, and screamed at him as they searched him. He was just doing his job. I later commented how that must have been humiliating, and he replied, "We are humiliated every day." So another example of the humiliation. This was on the day of that tour, and we were in Hebron walking around, and the soldiers, we came upon these soldiers who had been very nice to us earlier, but now they had these 2 Palestinian young men, and they were frisking them. And these young men had probably been through about 3 checkpoints in the last half hour, because there's checkpoints everywhere in Hebron. And here they were again. There was no real reason to do this except to humiliate them. And the soldiers told us not to take pictures, but some of us did, to document what we were seeing. So this is the humiliation that the Palestinians have to live with in so much of the West Bank. And these young men are with soldiers their own age, but those soldiers have the power of life and death over them. And this is what they endure every day. And they see their families endure it, their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, even children. So it's this constant humiliation. And during a visit to Birzeit University near Ramallah, I chatted with some Palestinian students, talking about the places I'd visited in the West Bank. As a Canadian, I could travel easily through the many internal Israeli military checkpoints. One young woman in this picture looked at me, her eyes full of sadness, and said, quote, "You have seen more of my country than I have." Israeli restrictions made it difficult for her to travel far from her community. For all Obama's early talk of Palestinian rights, his September 2011 speech to the UN revealed the extent to which he had backtracked and adopted the, quote, core elements of the Israeli master narrative. So here's an excerpt from his speech to the UN. Quote, "Let us be honest with ourselves. Israel is surrounded by neighbors that have waged repeated wars against it. Israeli citizens have been killed by rockets fired at their houses and suicide bombs on their buses. Israeli children come of age knowing that throughout the region, other children are taught to hate them. Israel, a small country of less than 8 million people, looks out at a world where leaders of much larger nations threaten to wipe it off the map. The Jewish people carry the burden of centuries of exile and persecution, and fresh memories of knowing that 6 million people were killed simply because of who they are. Those are the facts. They cannot be denied." Obama embraced and repeated Israel's claims of victimhood and that it lived in a state of constant existential danger. Left unsaid was the conclusion that for such a victim, quote, "almost anything is permitted and much can be forgiven." Israel could do almost anything in the name of survival without fear of condemnation. In November 2012, Israel launched an 8-day assault on Gaza. Hamas had been firing rockets to protest the blockade. Hamas had been firing rockets to protest the blockade, Israeli attacks on civilians, and attacks on Gazan fishing boats. After 8 days, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. Hamas pledged to stop rockets and border attacks, and Israel agreed to stop incursions into Gaza and open the border crossings for aid. However, Israel reneged. A few months later, a Gazan told a journalist, quote, "They tried to keep us on a diet. They will not let us become like Somalia, but they need to keep us busy worrying about food and electricity and sewage and shortages, not about politics and our struggle with Israel and long-term objectives." In July 2013, another round of peace negotiations began in Washington, D.C. They lasted 9 months before breaking down over Netanyahu's inflexibility in the continuous settlement building. Over 14,000 units had been started during the peace talks. An American spokesperson said, quote, "Israel's drumbeat of settlement announcements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem poisoned the atmosphere and doomed any chance of a breakthrough with the Palestinians." Abbas then signed 15 international conventions regarding human rights, and in late April 2014, he agreed to elections and a unity government with Hamas. This infuriated Netanyahu, and he told Abbas to choose between Hamas or peace with Israel. In early June, a unity government was formed. A few days later, Hamas sympathizers kidnapped 3 Israeli settler teens in the West Bank. Israel began a massive crackdown of Hamas members. Hamas reacted with increased rocket fire from Gaza, and Israel prepared to invade. The assault started on July 8th and lasted for 51 days. Again, Israel resorted to disproportionate force that resulted in massive, indiscriminate loss of life and destruction. By the time a ceasefire was signed in late August, Israel had killed 2,200 Palestinians, 70% of them civilians. Israeli losses included 6 civilian deaths and 67 soldiers. Israel destroyed more than 16,000 buildings and much of Gaza's infrastructure, including a university, several hospitals, and 70 mosques. Almost all Israelis and most Western governments supported Israel. So we can take a break, and any comments or questions? Sorry about that, Jane. In early 2015, Netanyahu was reelected. The Israeli public was more right-wing than ever and had no tolerance for criticism of the occupation. Quote, "Compassion of the other," said one left-wing activist, quote, "is viewed as treason. Dissident human rights organizations and other NGOs were viewed as the enemy from within." Israelis approved of their government managing the occupation rather than resolving it. Periodic attacks on Gaza were openly described as, quote, "mowing the lawn." Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon explained, quote, "I am not looking for a solution. I am looking for a way to manage the conflict and maintain relations in a way that works for our interests." An Israeli expert said, quote, "Just like mowing your front lawn, this is constant hard work. If you fail to do so, weeds grow wild and snakes begin to slither around in the brush." And another added, quote, "Against a well-entrenched non-state enemy like Hamas, Israel simply needs to, quote, mow the grass once in a while to degrade enemy capabilities." The goal was not to defeat Hamas, but rather to allow it to govern in an isolated, weakened state with minimal influence in the West Bank. A united Palestinian leadership had to be avoided. Historian Avi Shleim explains, quote, "It was a strategy of managing the conflict, of avoiding peace talks, of using the PA as a subcontractor for Israeli security in the West Bank, and of containing Palestinian resistance within the open-air prison of the Gaza Strip. This policy of playing the PA off against Hamas led to some bizarre situations. In 2015, Gaza was collapsing and Hamas was broke. So Netanyahu struck a secret deal with Qatar to secretly send millions of dollars to Gaza each month. At a Likud conference in 2019, Netanyahu explained, quote, anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is a part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. Following the 2014 Gaza war, a sense of hopelessness and despair pervaded the West Bank, accompanied by, quote, the strangulation of daily life under occupation. In Gaza, rocket fire had stopped, but the blockade continued. Conditions only grew worse, and a UN report warned that by 2020, Gaza would be unfit for human habitation. Israeli intelligence agreed. Media outlets and aid organizations accused Israel of turning Gaza into, quote, a human rubbish heap or a ghetto and a sinking ship. In January 2017, Obama's presidency ended. He had differed little from his predecessors and made good on his statement of a few years earlier when he said, quote, my administration's commitment to Israel's security has been unprecedented. One of his last acts was to finalize a 10-year, $38 billion military aid package for Israel. Donald Trump supported Israel and implemented a paradigm shift in American policy. In late 2017, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the American embassy there. After Palestinians condemned the move, Trump ended aid to the PA as well as to UNRWA. In 2017, Hamas chose a new leader in Gaza. Yahya al-Sinwar was a, quote, ruthlessly pragmatic hardliner from a family of refugees and had spent over 20 years in Israeli prisons. That same year, Hamas issued a new charter. Gone was the anti-Semitic language, replaced with an explanation that the enemy were not Jews in general, but the Zionists who occupy Palestine. As one leader said, quote, they occupied our lands, attacked our people, and forced them out of their homes. The charter described Hamas as a nationalist liberation and resistance movement with Islam as its frame of reference. It also indicated acceptance of a two-state solution. Overall, the language was flexible and revealed a pragmatism, signs of moderation, and a willingness to negotiate. The reaction of the Western world only strengthened Hamas hardliners. Europe and the US rejected it, and Netanyahu made an on-camera display of throwing a copy into a wastebasket. On March 30th, 2018, after Friday prayers, 30,000 Gazans marched to the border fence with Israel for a peaceful, nonviolent protest. The demonstration, which was organized by independent activists, called for an end to the occupation and the blockade that was slowly killing them, and the recognition of Gazans' right of return. An organizer explained that the protests, quote, were peaceful marches to tell the world that it's time for the Palestinian people's occupation to end so they can live in dignity in an independent and free state. Israeli snipers killed 15 protesters and wounded 1,400. Undaunted, the protesters returned again and again, every Friday for over a year. Each time, Israeli forces replied with deadly fire. The worst loss of life occurred on May 14th when soldiers killed 60 protesters and wounded 2,700 more. The UN Human Rights Council established an inquiry and affirmed that Israel, as an occupying power, was obliged to protect the people of Gaza and ensure their welfare. However, the commissioner said, quote, Gazans are in essence caged in a toxic slum from birth to death. deprived of dignity, dehumanized by the Israeli authorities to such a point it appears officials do not even consider that these men and women have a right as well as every reason to protest. During the first year, Israeli soldiers killed 266 protesters and wounded over 30,000. The demonstrations became known as the Great March of Return. The Western media largely parroted the Israeli narrative that Hamas was behind the protests, that the protesters were armed, and that Israeli soldiers acted in self-defense. However, the UN concluded that none of this was true. The organizers came from all sectors of Palestinian society. The protesters were unarmed, and none of them posed a threat to Israeli soldiers. Far from acting in self-defense, Israeli snipers targeted protesters far from the fence, between 150 and 400 meters. Victims included children, journalists, and first responders. Human rights organizations condemned Israel for carrying out a, quote, deliberate, calculated, intentional, murderous assault against civilians. So much for peaceful, nonviolent resistance. In July 2018, Israel passed a basic law that strengthened the nation's racist apartheid character. Israel's basic laws are constitutional in nature, and the, quote, basic law on Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people legalized the discrimination that Palestinians in Israel experience. It stipulates that only Jews have the right to national self-determination. This guarantees that Israel will never be a democracy with equality for all its citizens, but rather an ethnocracy. A Likud politician explained, quote, we are enshrining this important bill into law today to prevent even the slightest thought, let alone attempt, to transform Israel into a country of all its citizens. Criticism was immediate. An Israeli academic observed that, quote, it treats Israeli Palestinians as if they were trespassers in Israel. B'Tselem, a leading Israeli human rights organization, declared, quote, the nation-state basic law establishes that distinguishing Jews in Israel from non-Jews is fundamental and legitimate. The law permits institutionalized discrimination in favor of Jews in settlement, housing, land development, citizenship, language, and culture. Jewish supremacy has now been enshrined in basic law, making it a binding constitutional principle. This signals to state institutions that they not only can, but must promote Jewish supremacy in the entire area under Israeli control. Trump continued to reverse Mideast policy. And in November 2019, his administration announced that Israeli settlements were legal under international law. 2 months later, he unveiled a peace plan for Israel and Palestine, part of a Mideast normalization drive known as the Abraham Accords, whereby Qatar and the United Arab Emirates recognized Israel. Trump's plan envisioned an emasculated Palestinian state consisting of several enclaves wholly dependent on Israel and possessing, quote, conditional limited sovereignty. Predictably, the Palestinians had not been consulted. The plans for Palestine died with the end of Trump's presidency in 2020. Joe Biden, a lifelong Zionist, was indifferent to Palestinian suffering and focused on persuading Saudi Arabia to normalize ties with Israel. The Saudis insisted that any deal involve a resolution of the Palestine problem. However, many observers believed that a symbolic effort would be sufficient, and then the Palestinians could be pushed aside and forgotten. In early May 2021, protests erupted across Israel and the occupied territories in what became known as the Unity Intifada. The uprising was triggered by Israel's attempts to evict several Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem, to make room for illegal Israeli settlers. A day after protests began, Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where 70,000 worshippers had gathered for Ramadan prayers. Hamas responded with rocket fire from Gaza, and Israel retaliated with bombing. Protests spread across the West Bank, and for the first time, 48 Palestinians in Israel joined in. On May 18th, Palestinians in the occupied territories and Israel united and observed an unprecedented general strike. A Palestinian analyst observed, quote, Palestinians are emerging unified, regardless of the colonial space that they are permitted to exist in. The idea of a unified strike constitutes a declaration of rejection against all agreements that divide the land. Here's a couple more slides. Three days later, a ceasefire ended the fighting. The Unity Intifada exposed the stark divisions that existed within Israeli society and strengthened the bonds between 48 Palestinians and Palestinians under occupation. In 2020, DIDN, an Israeli human rights NGO, issued a report declaring that Israel was guilty of the crime of apartheid, a crime against humanity. The Apartheid Convention defines apartheid as, quote, inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. The DIDN report was one of 6 exhaustive studies published between 2020 and 2022. They confirmed what had been common knowledge for decades, that Israel is an apartheid regime. The DIDN report concluded, quote, the crime against humanity of apartheid is being committed in the West Bank. The perpetrators are Israelis and the victims are Palestinians. The Israeli regime in its entirety is an apartheid regime. In early 2021, B'Tselem, another Israeli human rights NGO, published a study. A few excerpts. Quote, in the entire area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, the Israeli regime implements laws, practices, and state violence designed to cement the supremacy of one group, Jews, over another, Palestinians. The roughly 5 million Palestinians who live in the occupied Palestinian territories, or the OPT, cannot participate in the political system that governs their lives and determines their futures. Israel also denies Palestinians in the OPT political rights such as freedom of speech and freedom of association. These accumulated measures all form the basis for our conclusion that the bar for labeling the Israeli regime as apartheid has been met. In April 2021, Human Rights Watch published a massive 220-page study. An excerpt, quote, on the basis of its research, Human Rights Watch concludes that the Israeli government has demonstrated an intent to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. In the OPT, this intent has been coupled with systemic oppression of Palestinians and inhumane acts committed against them. When these 3 elements occur together, they amount to the crime of apartheid. In February 2022, Amnesty International released an exhaustive 280-page report. An excerpt, quote, Israel has established and maintained an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination of the Palestinian population for the benefit of Jewish Israelis, a system of apartheid wherever it has exercised control over Palestinian lives since 1948. So what's notable about the Amnesty International report is they're saying that the apartheid doesn't just exist in the West Bank, but in all of the land that Israel controls, including Israel proper. So that's what made that sort of stand out a little bit. A day before the report, before the Amnesty International report was released, the day before it, an Israeli official dismissed it as, quote, false, biased, and anti-Semitic. The foreign minister added, quote, Amnesty quotes lies spread by terrorist organizations. In November 2022, Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights NGO, published a 200-page report taking a, quote, decolonization approach. Quote, Israel's institutionalized regime of racial domination and oppression over the Palestinian people as a whole cannot be understood or dismantled without an appreciation of its settler colonial character. To read any of these reports is to acquire a thorough education. They're all available online, and I encourage you to study them. 2022 was the deadliest year in the West Bank since the end of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Israeli soldiers and settlers killed over 200 Palestinians. After years of nonviolent resistance, young men in the West Bank who had come of age since the Al-Aqsa Intifada were embracing armed resistance, and Palestinian society was supporting them. Late that year, Israelis elected the most far-right government in history. Almost all the members embrace extreme religious messianic nationalism, support settlement expansion, reject a Palestinian state, and approve harsh responses to Palestinian resistance. The cabinet is full of far-right extremists. Bezalel Smotrich is a self-described, quote, fascist homophobe who wants to annex the West Bank, and Itamar Ben-Gvir has been convicted of terrorism and has campaigned for the expulsion of Palestinians. So where do things stand on October 6, 2023? The Israeli occupation was in its 56th year. Over 500,000 Israeli settlers lived in 200 plus illegal settlements in the West Bank. Another 200,000 lived in occupied East Jerusalem. Settlements were growing. Palestinians had no civil, political, or human rights, and Israeli soldiers and settlers humiliated and terrorized them daily in countless different ways. The occupied territories were giant open-air prisons. Israel controlled the borders, airspace, water, electricity, population registry, and economy. The PA and Hamas controlled internal security, and international donors paid for the upkeep. Between the year 2000 and October 6, 2023, Israeli forces had killed more than 10,600 Palestinians. This compared to 1,329 Israeli fatalities, an eightfold difference. The peace process was stalled. 30 years after the, quote, interim Oslo Accord, Palestinians had nominal control of only 3% of the West Bank. Gaza was in its 15th year of a stifling blockade. 80% of its population depended on aid, and more than half lived in abject poverty. Half the population were children. A 16-year-old in Gaza had already experienced 4 wars and countless airstrikes and skirmishes. International law had determined that the occupation of the West Bank is illegal. The annexation of East Jerusalem is illegal. The blockade of Gaza is illegal. The West Bank settlements are illegal, and the separation wall is illegal. The U.S. remained Israel's strongest and most unquestioning ally, providing billions yearly in foreign aid. It also vetoed almost every UN Security Council resolution critical of Israel. The Biden administration was ignoring the Palestine problem and trying to complete a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. Israel viewed Gaza as a security issue. The Gazans were out of sight and out of mind of most Israelis, and the, quote, pacifying and containing 2 million Palestinians indefinitely seemed feasible. Among the Hamas leadership, there was no incentive for moderation. The West's rejections of the 2006 elections, the unity government, and the 2017 charter, coupled with the massacre of innocents during the March of Return, had further demonstrated the futility of working for a diplomatic or political solution. Power was firmly in the hands of the hardliner faction, who had become, quote, more uncompromising, more militant, and more intransigent. Allies such as Iran had provided the opportunity for meaningful armed resistance, and the leaders were planning to exploit it. In their eyes, they had run out of options. What did they have to lose? America and Israel believed that the occupation was being effectively managed. On October 29th, the U.S. National Security Advisor declared that, quote, the Middle East region is quieter than it has been in 2 decades. So we're at the end of our journey. 9 weeks ago, we set out to answer the question, why? Why are these things happening? Palestinian activist Ahmed Abu Artama advised us to read the book from chapter 1 to, quote, understand the background, the root of the problem. We've tried to do that. Sadly, the medium of Zoom does not lend itself to discussions among large groups. In their place, I'll offer a few thoughts, which I hope will be helpful. So why are these things happening? Because from the outset, the ideology of Zionism has manifested itself as a particularly destructive form of settler colonialism, predicated on racial and ethnic supremacy and the erasure of the indigenous Palestinian people. Zionists have always wanted the land without the people. For the Zionist project to succeed, it had to disappear the Palestinians. Why is this happening? Because from the beginning, Western powers and superpowers, especially Britain and the United States, have nurtured, sponsored, supported, armed, and defended the Zionist project as an imperialist outpost in the region. Why is this happening? Because the West has deemed Israel to be special and therefore above international law. Israel can do as it pleases without Western censure. Why is this happening? Because the Zionists in Israel embraced ethnic cleansing, violent suppression of the indigenous people, and the establishment of an apartheid state. Why is this happening? Because Israel and the West have successfully dehumanized the Palestinian people. Maybe you have other reasons and you can add them in the chat. We can look at them. And finally, these things are happening in spite of the Palestinian people's continued heroic, determined, and principled attempts to liberate themselves and establish a Palestinian homeland. They have tried everything, cooperating with the superpowers, armed resistance, general strikes, boycotts, diplomatic initiatives, negotiations, compromise, complying with international law, a commitment to the democratic process, and popular nonviolent resistance. They have left no stone unturned. My intent in offering these talks is to better equip people of conscience who wish to be effective allies of the Palestinian people. I feel that everyone who cares can do something and should do something. Many of you have probably identified that, quote, something, and you're busy doing it. But for those of you who haven't, here's a few ideas. I'll let you look at that for a minute, and then we'll keep going. The first thing to do is get informed. Educate yourself. Do the work. These talks are just an imperfect, incomplete beginning. Learn from Palestinians and seek out the many good books and resources that are available online. There is no excuse for not being informed. An informed ally is an effective ally. Second, break the silence and talk about what's going on. Israel and its supporters want us to remain silent, but silence is not an option. Silence is complicity. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Third, boycott Israeli companies and institutions and any organizations that profit from the oppression of the Palestinian people. Research the BDS movement. Fourth, organize and work with others. When we do, good things happen. Working together, we can bring about change. Fifth, help create apartheid-free communities. So this is an initiative that over 1,000 communities and organizations in Canada and the United States have already joined. And I think some of you might know that the city of Brampton in Ontario has just signed on to become an apartheid-free community. And finally, pressure members of parliament to change Canada's foreign policies so that they promote human rights and align with international law. History tells us that people in power won't change without pressure from below, us, the voters. If we want to see an end to the century-long war on the Palestinian people, we must hold the feet of our elected representatives to the fire and demand that Canada advocate for a political settlement that ensures decolonization and that everyone who lives between the river and the sea enjoys equal human rights, freedom, safety, security, and political self-determination. Write letters to MPs, sign petitions, send emails, and support organizations that lobby our government for change. Most of you know that it's not easy to stand up for Palestine. If we support other causes, everybody cheers us. But if we stand up for Palestine, people may attack and stigmatize us. But we must look for ways, because in the end, it's about more than just Palestine. When we support the Palestinian struggle for liberation, we're affirming our own humanity. We're also standing up for the oppressed everywhere, for human rights everywhere, for self-determination everywhere, for equality everywhere, for democracy everywhere, and for humanity everywhere. So keep talking about Palestine and keep working for Palestine. Let's give Palestine our best. So we've come to the end of our talk and the end of the session.